Guys, you want to start the episode?
Where's Daniel though? Doesn't he do the starting thing?
Yeah, I think Daniel got cancelled. I heard
Oh
he
really?
said some really inappropriate gamer words.
Oh,
Oh
that's
no, not the
that's
gamer
tragic.
words.
Poor Daniel.
Alright.
And those poor minorities that have been affected by those gamer words.
Yeah. It's a shame we had to cancel him.
It had to be done.
Wait a second. Is that right though? I'm not sure if I'm cool with cancel culture. You guys want to talk about that?
Yeah, let's talk about
Yeah,
that.
sure.
Yeah. Okay. Sick intro.
Good intro, good intro.
Now what? Now what?
No.
Okay, yeah, guys. So this episode is going to be about cancel culture and call out culture because they're inherently intertwined. So since it's going to be a very serious video, actually breaking it down, I think it's important to start with baseline definition for both terms.
Yeah, so call out culture is essentially when a group of people want to publicly accuse someone of causing a problem, doing a serious offense, and they want to bring attention to that kind of offense. Cancel culture takes that a step further because these people are actively trying to destroy these people's reputation and career. If this is a celebrity, they would want to boycott them, they would want to destroy any kind of career prospects that they might have.
So yeah,
Yeah.
fair definition, everybody. Nothing to cancel us over. Okay.
Sounds about right.
All right. So now that the terms are set, I guess we can jump into our points of view. One thing that I just wanted to note about cancel culture that I noticed is that you don't have to try to explicitly cancel the person, though. I feel like it basically has the same effect when you don't do it explicitly. When everyone tries to rally people to bandwagon against someone, they try to shut out all of their responses, censor them, reject all of their apologies, continuously saying that nothing they've done to make up for it is good enough. And when even if you say that you're willing to give someone another chance, but you make it basically impossible for them to make it up to you in their eyes, you're still canceling them. If someone tries to defend themselves and you're one of those people who tries to go, oh, he's making excuses, he's not owning his faults, even though he's just trying to defend himself from certain allegations, I think you're basically trying to cancel that person as well.
All right. And I think, if I may add something, one important caveat to add in our discussion is to have an additional consideration between canceling public figures versus canceling just like some random person out there in public who said something dumb on Twitter, right?
Yeah, I
Because
think that's true.
the damage that can be done is different. Because if you're canceling a public figure, chances are like they're already rich, they're already established, and whatever canceling you'll try to do, well, at least like the damage won't be too severe, as opposed to like canceling some random person on Twitter, like getting their jobs away from them or their futures like taken away from them. Like the magnitude has to be considered there.
Yeah, definitely. And one example probably of call out or cancel culture would be the Me Too movement, which is where, a lot of women come together and speak out against people in their lives who have sexually harassed them. It has become a very popular movement, especially in industries where these issues are very prevalent, like in media or in, I guess, some aspects of politics.
Yeah.
Yeah. But even on a micro scale, I think cancel culture plays out a lot even in our daily lives. Like every time there's been a whole Twitter scandal in Pisay, and when someone says something particular about climate change, and everyone just wants to silence them forever. It's a smaller scale, but it's cancel culture nonetheless.
Yeah, definitely.
I guess, yeah.
If we're going to be analyzing call out culture and cancel culture, it's really important to understand why exactly people want to join it. Why do they want to do it? So, first of all, First of all, they want to conform because inherently call out culture is very vocal. It's usually done through things like social media. It's things that are going viral essentially. And it's something that is within the mainstream. So when you have this very vocal group, people on the sidelines, they're gonna be watching and they're gonna say, okay, this kind of thing seems popular. It seems like a lot of people are joining. I'm just gonna join for the hell of it. And I mean, this is pretty inherent to human nature because we always want to be part of a community. We inherently want to form groups and we don't want to be alone. So if you have this very strong movement, you're going to want to join that community and have that feeling of security, have that feeling that you're like in on the joke or something like that. And but aside from just, okay, you want to join this kind of community, because of how vocal and volatile cancel or call out culture can be, obviously you don't want to be the target of that movement. So even if you don't necessarily agree with what these people are saying, you're just going to tag along because you don't want to be canceled as well. You're just trying to protect yourself, you're trying to protect your image, and you don't want to go against what people perceive as morally right. And this can be really harmful, especially if your views are actually something that is valid, or maybe you don't agree with some parts of the Me Too movement. Maybe you don't necessarily think that that kind of cancel culture is the best way to deal with whatever crime or offense the person who is being accused. You don't think that it necessarily matches up. So essentially, you're removing the corrective system that will temper that call out culture. You're making it so much harder for people, for the movement to change at all. And that really sucks because it's just going to be, because you're shutting out all other opinions, all other points of views that could enrich the discussion, that could make it so much better, that could make the system so much fairer, because we talked about how it could be really unjust and it's definitely not the best system of correction that we have present in our culture. Yeah, but also generally when you have a lot of young impressionable people who don't have their values necessarily sorted out yet, because this call out culture, because this cancel culture is the thing that they see the most, they're going to accept that as the ultimate moral truth. And everything else, they're not really going to be willing to accept it anymore. And that is pretty harmful because they're going to see everyone else as other to them, as the out group, as people who they should not be uh, conversing with, as people who they should not be engaging in conversations with. And it also just, teaches them that, okay, this is the right way to handle opposing opinions, which is, of course, just really bad on all levels of discussion, on all levels of justice and the like. But aside from wanting to conform, a lot of I guess the general argument against call out culture is that people are just trying to be woke, right? So it has a pretty negative connotation. Yeah, it has gained a pretty negative connotation in previous years, like the label of being woke. And being woke can give you a sense of superiority. It can make you feel a lot more intelligent because if everyone else is also agreeing with me, then I must be right. Then what I'm saying must definitely be true. And when you're putting someone else down, you essentially feel like, okay, I'm better than this person because I know what is right, I know what is good, and like and uh yeah, and that can, I guess, make you feel make you addicted to just wanting to always be the hero, be like the trendsetter in those kinds of situations and in those kinds of issues. So you're always going to want to, I don't know, be controversial in that sense.
I think one interesting idea that we can add into this discussion is that the reason why a lot of the call out or cancel things on Twitter seem nakakabobo is that only the debatable cases get popularized. Because when you think about it, if someone did something that was obviously racist or something that was obviously discriminatory, then like justice will almost immediately get delivered. Like the people at their job or something will automatically remove their job once they see something happened. So discourse will automatically die past that point because justice has already been delivered. But if you have a borderline case where someone did something that may or may not be like discriminatory, that's when people start debating it. They're going to be like, this thing actually isn't discriminatory because of these reasons. And then someone will chime in with their reason saying, well, this is obviously discriminatory because of X, Y, and Z. And that cycle will continue until the entire thing blows up. And then you have like an unclear discourse on your hands. That's why most of the cases get popular are the cases without any evidence, for example. So I guess that's just something we have to consider during this discussion of call out culture. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's true because people who are looking to clout chase or people who are looking to do their own unique part for the movement, they're going to gravitate to these borderline cases.
Yeah, they're fringe cases, pero ano, they're the fringe cases that get popular.
People like to clout chase in places where they can be a trendsetter. That is the nature of people who want to be pawok. Like I saw comments on Huling El Bimbo, where the characters are portrayed as the spawn of Satan and intentionally like malicious against Joy because no one no one is trying to be woke on Huling El Bimbo. So clearly they're gonna try to be woke on it if they're cloud chasing. These divisive cases that no one is talking about yet, and they try to call out and cancel those people in those cases, which makes it even more dangerous because they clearly don't know the nuance. So that's why these cases are even more likely to exist. They try to grab on to any example that they can use to they try to latch on to any opportunity to cancel someone, and that makes it so that people are even when people might be undeserving in those scenarios. And I think the same can be said about people who are genuinely trying to help the movement and make a difference. Because, definitely a lot of people really have good intentions, but they're still unable to contribute positively to the movement because of just their short-sightedness. So it could be that they lack research and they fall victim to fake news or propaganda. So similarly, extreme people who are trying to grab headlines, who claim to be credible sources of information, people get their news from these people and end up not truly understanding it. And, it's basically a slippery slope ripple effect because once they don't have the right baseline of information, when they try to apply it in their own lives, they don't understand the nuance, they miss it, and then they suddenly just make a tweet sounding off, trying to help the movement, but instead, falsely accusing someone, which again hurts the movement in the long run. And it's really sad because these people usually have a noble intention, they have a noble cause and movement, but they end up damaging it or being counterintuitive to the goal to begin with. And that's because of how public perception is everything. And one misstep that you make as a supposed member of the movement can turn so many people away from the movement as a whole.
Yeah, and I think that also highlights, I guess, just the general big downside of the strategy of call out culture, which is, everyone putting their own opinions like to the highest volume and just shouting it like into social media, right? Because when you have people who are very vocal, who want to support this movement, want to push it forward, and they're taught that this is the best way to do it, then you're like naturally shutting them off from the other strategies that could actually help push their cause forward. So when you have people who are very outspoken, that are very negative in how they approach call out and cancel culture, it just makes it so much harder for them to want to enter compromises with people who don't agree with them. And that kind of mentality is, I think, what eventually hinders these movements in the long run.
Okay, what are your stances on cancel culture?
Well, the way I see it, I think that there's definitely a place for cancel and call out culture. Like, obviously, a majority of the Me Too movement, if someone is a sexual harasser, or if someone is a sexual predator, or someone has truly committed a grave offense, then they deserve to be canceled, and the world should know of all the wrongdoings that they have done. However, the nature of cancel culture makes it very dangerous, because note that it's only acceptable if someone is truly guilty of the crime, and if the punishment given to them is proportionate. So, firstly, I think that in a vast majority of instances in which call out culture is used, people like to jump on it immediately because they flock to controversy before any evidence is present. Like, for example, with the whole Aziz Ansari case. So, Aziz Ansari is a very famous comedian. And as a part of the Me Too movement, some woman decided to come out and accuse him of sexual harassment, like even going to or the extent of rape, because he supposedly continued sexual advances even though she was not showing positive consent about it. And everyone was ready to basically cancel his whole career, end his whole career before he had even published a formal response. But it was later on found out that it's actually not true, that she was supposedly not giving consent, and it just turned out to be an unpleasant experience, but a consensual one nonetheless. And since then, like, he had like some irreparable damage done to his career. Like, he lost some deals with Comedy Central. Of course, his image was tarnished forever. Some people will refuse to even subscribe to anyone who's even been accused of sexual harassment, regardless of what his defense is. And basically, a tweet wrongly convicted an innocent man. And it's a lot of instances are very prone to this exact same thing happening. Like, as soon as someone makes an accusation, a lot of people will already convict you because of the absolute nature of call out culture. And I think that's very, very dangerous. And also, there's also the problem of going towards like a far too extreme extent. So, certain people can make a mistake for a number of reasons. Like, firstly, you don't know what mistake they even made, but people can make a mistake not necessarily because they have malicious intent. It could be just because they are misinformed, they're stupid, they're rash, but and just basically different reasons such as not having malintent would make it so that the punishment, I think, should not be as horrible as it is sometimes. Like, some people would really cancel people or try to end someone's career over a legitimate mistake, an honest mistake. And in those cases, I don't think it's fair either.
Yeah, there are a lot of different examples really wherein you have, these people who've been accused of something, and everyone is so quick to just jump on that bandwagon and say, okay, you're wrong. You deserve to have your career destroyed. And I think, I have I have pretty much the same uh view on it, that while it can bring some good in challenging, I guess, inherent structures that make it difficult for people to speak out about their experiences with things like sexual harassment, it's also really harmful how essentially you're removing that due process that makes it so that the punishment that is being given to these people is fair. And like another example, I guess, would be with Johnny Depp, whose wife Amber Heard, I think, um yeah, she like went to the media, she told them that she was being abused, and after that, so many people were calling for his contracts to be ended. They wanted to destroy him, his entire reputation. But after a few months, like, we discovered that it was actually him who was on the receiving end of all of that physical and verbal abuse. And I think that that's just a more amplified version of how damaging it can really be to have that call out culture, because there is no forgiveness within it. And because of that, it would have been so hard for him to want to come out and speak against it, because everyone's gonna look at him and say, like, I think that you're guilty, and they won't believe anything that he says after that. So just how it establishes a lot more divide, and a lot more, I guess, polarization in that sense. I think it can be really harmful.
Yeah. I think overall, cancel culture still plays a role in our society because it's easy to think of the cases in which it can go wrong. As I've said before, you really have to consider the damage that's being done to these people being canceled in proportion to the actual harm that they caused, right? So you shouldn't try to cancel people who really don't deserve to be canceled if you don't have any evidence, or if like they're too small of a target. But I think on a societal level, cancel culture does play a good role. And the way I like to think about it is, think about how much attitudes on homophobia have changed these past few decades, right? Because it's really hard to find someone in society right now who's like blatantly homophobic. But just go back a few years, a few decades, and it's easy to see a lot of homophobic people in like the mainstream media. And I think that like canceling people who have been homophobic has been a big part of reducing like that blatant aspect in our society, right? So I think that call out culture does play a key role in changing the key norms in our society. And even better is that it helps the people who are most disadvantaged, like minorities, because you're essentially amplifying their voice by serving as sort of like more power for them to act through. Yeah.
I think that's true. I think that's equally important because you have something so blatantly inhumane like homophobia, and it's a problem that really ruins people's lives. So um, you know, given the fact that if you wait, given the fact that using an extreme method, basically, regardless of whether you support that method or not, it's a surefire way to make sure that people become more careful about the way that they act. And I mean, it's inevitable that there's going to be some abuses along the way. But at the end of the day, like, generally, it's probably still done more good than harm. But that assumes also that it has done more good than harm. And I think that's debatable, especially in certain cases nowadays. Because just like Rhea said, I think it's very true that it polarizes the discussion a lot more. Because every time someone cancels someone wrongly, more people are going to be less willing to listen to people coming out about their stories of sexual abuse at the same time. So you have these people like the Me Too movement is the enemy. And I think that's the worst outcome that can happen because that's a person that's immediately lost to the movement. And that's something that I think is at the heart, should be at the heart of the discussion because call out culture and cancellation is usually done in the name of a movement, right? And the goal of a movement, wait, yeah, um, yeah, in the name of a movement, because you want a movement like the fight against homophobia or the fight for women's rights to succeed. But a movement needs support. You need to improve your public rapport, your public perception, so people want to join and support your cause in the long run. And I think call out culture and cancel culture alienates people in a lot of ways. Firstly, I think it provides a really high barrier of entry for people to join and it pushes people away. Is it okay if I do this part? It's medyo long.
Okay, so I think like while we're discussing call out culture and cancel culture, like we have to differentiate between like the different kinds of crimes that can occur because we've been discussing things about sexual harassment and those kinds of things, and I think those kinds of crimes are different from things like calling someone certain words, right? Because things like sexual harassment, those are things that you can try in a court, while certain things like being homophobic or transphobic, those aren't things that you can like bring to a court. So I think the role of call out culture and cancel culture plays differently along those different crimes because like if someone is being homophobic, you can't bring them to a court, right? There's no way to correct their behavior. While if someone is being sexually harassed, like aside from resorting to call out culture, they can also try the judicial courts, right? So there's a key difference that we have to note there.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
It's important to have like a court for lesser crimes because things like homophobia are just equally in okay. Calling someone names is not equally inhumane, but it's also inhumane and it needs to be tried. But I'm not
Yeah.
really sure if call out culture in its present state is the best approximation of a court because again, like we've discussed how it can be very one-sided on the side of the accuser. But that's true though. It needs to exist. But I guess it just needs some refinement. That sounds like a conclusion way too early in the episode, pero
I think the refinement for like fixing homophobia is regular court because before we had actual laws for equality, we just had call out culture. I think call out culture is like a good intermediary step towards building actual laws. And I think like that's something we could use for like transgenders right now because like sure it's less acceptable to be homophobic, but like people still like that song the like that got canceled on Twitter
may nakilala.
against that was like transphobic. Yes, that song. So I think like cancel culture does good work in cases like those where people who initially thought like, hey, look at this, it's a funny song, like they get kind of like they get forced to consider whether it's actually funny or if it's like affecting a certain group of people who they didn't necessarily think about before. So I think cancel culture does good in cases like those.
And I think based on the goals of a movement, call out and cancel culture alienates people for two reasons. So firstly, it provides a high barrier of entry to the cause and pushes people away. Okay, so when you create generalized statements such as men are trash or the Twitter equivalent which is oh straight man content is so trash, oh this is why straight men are always just garbage, blah blah blah. If you make generalized statements like oh my god, I swear if you've ever done blank then you're clearly a bigot. Like if you've ever said the N-word in your life, you're clearly a bigot. and you're racist and you want black people to die or something like that, which is an extension or an offshoot of cancel culture because of your how you're trying to like call out the behavior in such a in a radical way. You're prone to exaggerating and accusing people of and falsely accusing people of things that aren't necessarily true, especially like first with like the if you say this word you're clearly a bigot. Before all of us became woke, as stupid kids, let's face it, how many of us have used the N word or said it jokingly or been peer pressured into saying it? Okay, that's something that we all share as part of our youthful ignorance. Okay, when you try to call out ignorance for malicious intent, people are going to get mad. Okay, when people see this and when you start accusing people of that kind of stuff, they're gonna say, "No, that's not true. You're lying. I said this and okay, I said the N word. Maybe I'm insensitive. Maybe I'm stupid, and maybe that's not a good thing to do. But for you to say that I think that a certain race is below me or a certain group of people is below me, that's not true. I know myself. I know that that's not what I'm doing." Now all of a sudden, in that person's mind, your movement looks hateful. Your movement looks like a group of liars. And since perception is everything, and that's all that matters to these people are unlikely to want to support your cause. In fact, they're probably going to join the opposition. When you look at true bigots and true radical hate groups, on average, do not look like evil people. They come in like wolves in sheep's clothing. They come to you and they welcome you with open arms. They try to say things like, "Oh, look at all these libtards who won't even let you make jokes or want to censor you or want to take away all your rights. You should join us. You should join the opposition. We should rally against movements like the Me Too movement or women's rights movements." That's what's going to happen. Like when these people see these alternatives, it seems a lot better to them, right? And
If I know,
yeah,
can I
okay, go.
interject? I think that's a lot of steps, and that's not
That
likely
that
to
is likely to
happen
happen though. Do you know how many
because
people? Do you know how many people?
because like for example, like the way that cancel culture works is that it essentially tries to lower your social value as a person if you say certain words, and like that's not something that like just affects you as a person. It affects like society around you. So wait, how do I phrase this? So I just don't think that the way people will react to cancel culture, like banning certain words, is by automatically joining the opposition. Like, for example, if you're a person who used to say the N word a lot, but now you don't say it in fear of being canceled, it's not likely that you're gonna like suddenly become a radical anti-feminist or something and try to align yourself with people in
Yeah,
the
I'm not saying.
opposition. Like, you're not just gonna suddenly start hating black people because they
Yeah,
forbid you to
exactly.
say the
But
N
you're
word.
not gonna start hating black people. But firstly, it starts with not being receptive to a cause. So obviously, you don't start hating women, but you're highly unlikely to join the feminist movement because that's the same movement that hates you. In fact, like if you know certain people, like if you actually talk to certain people who react to like call outs online and people getting canceled online, they're more likely to make those offensive jokes and they're more likely to be like, "Oh, this is so stupid, man. They're calling us like bigots just for this. I'm gonna say this word just to piss them off now." It okay, maybe it doesn't inherently bring you to the other side, but it leaves you opposed to this group. And given the fact that people like Ben Shapiro are so good at recruiting people to the conservative cause, then that's when they're going to join the opposition. Because look at like the way that Ben Shapiro operates, right? He doesn't get you to hate black people, but he gets you to antagonize the movement, like the liberal movement, and he also makes you less PC and makes you less willing to care about those certain rights. And like I'm sure all of us have had that phase.
Okay, I think what's key here is that like you have to understand that Ben Shapiro isn't part of the mainstream media, which is like the most popular media that most people consume, right? And the reason why he isn't part of mainstream media is like the reason that he's more likely to say things that are against the cause.
You know, like,
Okay.
okay, fine. Let's not use the example of
The
Ben
reason
Shapiro.
why,
Let's look
okay.
for someone who's in the in the mainstream media. Let's go for Trump. That is Trump's call to action, basically. No,
I
no,
don't
that's
think
it.
Trump is like,
Dude, have you not heard his speeches where he's like,
okay, okay.
I think we're the elites. The media tries to call us out, and I'm trying to remember how exactly he said it. Um, he had this one rally that I saw on CNN. He's like, the media tries to call us all of these things, call us all these names, but that's all fake news. That's blah 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 blah. We're just good people trying to defend our like family. But basta, that was his plan of action, basically, in a certain way. That was his platform for a lot of people.
So I think it's important to like think about the history of call out culture, because I think like call out culture existed in the past. Like think about the Red Scare in the United States when someone was just accused of being a communist, everyone just started canceling them outright. I think like there's a similar thing between what's going on right now and what went on in the past, because calling someone out, it's not just a leftist thing to do. People on the right often tend to do it also. Um One right issue that I think people like get canceled on is the idea of like stolen valor. This is when someone claims, for example, that they had experience in the military when really they didn't. I remember hearing a case on a podcast once where someone, a newscaster, claimed to be on a helicopter that got attacked during a mission, when in reality he was actually only reporting that incident. So what happened was people ended up canceling him. He lost his job. So I think this is important context to have, in that calling someone out, it's not just a thing that one side tends to do. So, but rather, what call out culture is it amplifies the voices of minorities within a certain population. Because, like, for example, what happened in the right perspective is that people in the military, people who are in the minority, got a bunch of people, convinced them to side with their cause and voice out their concerns. I think like call out culture isn't necessarily a bad thing, but rather it's a tool that can be used by any side of any movement to help prop up like whatever they're doing. And in the case of what's happening right now, I think it's important to help change like the field of discussion, to give more power to the people in the minority, to allow them to speak out. Like I think this is what they call shifting the overton window. In the past, it wasn't acceptable to think about like gay rights or trans rights, but now that we have shifted the overton window on that issue, it's now more acceptable for people to advocate for these kinds of causes. Yeah. So what the overton window is, I think, is that it generally defines what kinds of views are acceptable within a society. Like the overton window describes what beliefs should be far left, what beliefs should be far right, and what beliefs should be like in the mainstream or in the center. So how the overton window works is that it generally like how you shift it is by basically advocating for more things on a certain side of the spectrum. So if you try to like if the mainstream media begins to fill up with more things that are leftist, then that generally shifts the overton window to the left, which generally allows more leftist views to be considered as mainstream. Like what we're seeing right now, since the United States is trying to give out more like what you call it, giving trying to give everyone a basic income during the quarantine, that has made a general leftist view such as universal basic income more mainstream. So more people are willing to jump onto that boat and like push it forward as legislation in the future.
No, yeah, that's definitely true. There is no leftist or rightist bias. I think that it's definitely a tool that can work for both sides and in both ways, for good and for bad. But it just really depends on the way that people use it. And I think that people should generally err on the side of caution at least in terms of, you know, um, err on the side of caution, making sure that it proportionally affects individual people's lives, because obviously a cause is noble and you should be working towards that cause, pero you shouldn't use poor regular individuals as, collateral damage or as battering rams to be able to achieve that change at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's true. Like, I'm all for calling someone out once you have like solid proof that they did something wrong. Like, a part of me like cheers up when I see someone on Twitter being canceled for like making a TikTok, like a racist TikTok, then getting their scholarship rescinded. I think that's something that should happen because, like, that scholarship's going to someone who isn't racist. Yeah. But on the same vein, I think there's something wrong with like accusing someone on vague evidence out of a like clip that was taken out of context and using that to like basically ruin their entire careers. So there's basically a fine line, I think, on when call out culture is appropriate and when it's not.
That's true, because on one hand it can be a tool for social justice, and on the other hand it can be a tool for censorship, I guess. I think those are good banners to put for good and bad side.
Yeah, I just think that generally it can be a really great strategy for people who are not within mainstream, I guess, institutions, because, you're essentially just using the willpower of the masses to push your cause forward. It is pretty inspiring, and it kind of like gives a sense of hope that the really backwards views and the backwards culture that we have right now can still be corrected. But there is something wrong when people are so jaded, they're willing to destroy people's lives so quickly, and they take extreme joy out of that. It's just kind of scary that people don't really stop to think about the repercussions of canceling people and how it can really just do long-term damage on other people's lives.
Allow me to play devil's advocate though, because I mean, the thing is, even when some people necessarily do some toxic behavior or forward toxic backwards culture, I feel like a lot of the time, because of the fact that in a majority of instances, the actions that people do are a result of hundreds of years of toxic culture that has existed subconsciously in society. So the patriarchy, the class warfare, all of these things have put a lot of preconceived notions in our minds. So a lot of people act out of bad habits, bad tendencies, but a lot of the time, I don't think it's their fault. They can be just miseducated, uneducated. Like, look at a lot of the people who don't have the luxury of education in our country. They do things such as forward, toxic masculinity to their children because they don't know any better. They continue to vote based on identity politics, or they vote for political candidates based on popularity. They allow their votes to be bought because they don't know any better. But they don't necessarily hate other people. They're not necessarily corrupt people. And I don't think they deserve to be branded as the enemy because, firstly, systemic oppression has existed for hundreds of years, and people who forward it a lot of times are just agents of the patriarchy unknowingly. And also, again, there's the added factor that they're likely to be alienated and isolated from your cause, or they're going to be unable to recruit to your movement in the long run because they already think that you hate them and they brand you as the enemy. Yeah, that was a pretty long first part.
Yeah, so that's the first section of today's episode. That was a lot for us to unpack, but we still have the research section. We're still gonna come back, discuss how our opinions have been shaped by our information.
My man. Okay, so here we are again, guys. Research section. To summarize our discussion yesterday, a majority of our arguments were against cancel culture. It seems like the more extreme side of the spectrum, and call out culture is something that's a bit more divisive. It's really important to sound off about things, but cancel culture seems to take it a bit too far. So to start off our research section, we're going to start with cancel culture because again, that's the more extreme side of the spectrum. And then we're going to talk about call out culture, which is a bit of a middle ground. So anyone want to start with research that supports cancel culture?
Yeah. So for research that supports cancel culture, right? We have to look at instances where it was actually pretty successful in changing the culture and industry that that the call outs were targeting. Um, so specifically, uh, people like Harvey Weinstein, for example, who for the past 3 years has been the target of several accusations of sexual, abuse and intimidation, essentially, as like during his entire career in Hollywood as a movie producer. So he used his influence to pressure actors and actresses to perform sexual favors for him in exchange for furthering their career. And recently, in tandem with the Me Too movement, these individuals who were his victims stepped forward, and it was, essentially a domino effect. All of these people coming out and speaking against him and calling for him to resign, and calling for Hollywood as a whole to strengthen its support for people who want to report these kinds of things. So he was recently, found guilty of sexual assault, and he is going to be facing up to 25 years in prison for that conviction. So aside from that, he was also removed from his own company, and following this case, a lot of other accusations have been coming up against other Hollywood producers and people in the industry. So really, it's just reforming that entire landscape and to some extent making it a lot better and a lot easier for these budding actresses and actors to come forward about their experiences instead of being silenced. And also in cases with, Kevin Spacey, R. Kelly, these are prominent people in their respective fields. So just the entire cancel culture has taken away their power to perpetuate those abuses in the long run. But aside from that, of course, when people say that cancel culture silences the people who supposedly did all of those offenses, it delegitimizes it delegitimizes the feelings of those who are making those accusations in the first place. And if you look at it, right, the people who are making these kinds of accusations, the people who have to resort to cancel culture are largely people who are already on the shorter end of the stick when it comes to power dynamics. It's people who are just starting out in their career. It's people who are traditionally discriminated against, like women, like people in the LGBT community, people who are uh, people people of color, things like that. So essentially, if we're gonna be taking away cancel culture, if we're gonna be saying that this is not a valid strategy for minorities to use, we're going to be taking away a vital tool for them to speak up against their oppression.
Yeah, so that's true. I think the only reason that you need to resort to extremes and exaggerations is because of the power structure that inherently makes a power asymmetry that has existed forever and prevents people in power from being properly held accountable for anything. For anything. So I think it's an understatement that you need to be firing on all cylinders to be able to hold them accountable in any way. What's also interesting though is you have to take a step back and think about the conversation about cancel culture, because the problem when you speak out against cancel culture is that you're enabling people with malicious intentions to abuse that. So Sarah Hagi makes a good point. when she talks about how people try to label any kind of criticism as cancel culture and say, oh, this is oppressive. How could you do this to so many innocent people? But in reality, those people, the very same people who are talking about us silencing or censorship effect, are also trying to silence criticism coming out against them. Because a lot of the times, when people in positions of power throw around the term of cancel culture, they're just talking about any criticism. And we need to be able to avoid falling into the trap of thinking that any criticism is cancel culture and harmful. Because at that point, then we're dipping too far in the opposite direction. But at the same time, in my opinion, and news agencies such as Vox acknowledge it. In its purest instance, when people are really trying to cancel, when people are actually practicing cancel culture, I think it's usually a step too far, truly. Like when it goes beyond like pure criticism and you're trying to tear down one individual's whole life for either a mistake or bad behavior that is a product of systemic bigotry. I don't think that's fair.
Yeah, it really seems like an oversimplification of the problem when people have such a low barrier of entry to cancel culture. Anyone can participate in it, and a lot of people do choose to because it's a very vocal, very, I guess, popular mainstream way to express our opinions. And it really just encourages, really just leads to a lower quality discussion to some extent. It leads to people kind of making a joke out of it, taking it lightly, and it just is not the best way to address the issue in some instances.
I think the goal of cancel culture isn't really to help the individual being canceled, but rather to make that individual an example so that others will avoid the things that they have done. It's sort of like what's the word? It's sort of like what you call it? It's it's kind of a public punishment where you want to show people how brutal punishment can be for this certain crime in order to kind of invoke fear into them, right? Whereas I think call out culture is a better way of actually helping an individual, right? Because if you have call out culture, you at least have that hope of that person changing so that they can see or they can learn from their mistakes and they can actually adapt given the space that they actually need to have. Yeah.
Yeah, so one testimony from Tales from the Teenage Cancel Culture, an article from the New York Times, is from is, is a testimony about how essentially they've been socially isolated and how their past mistakes have continually shaped other people's opinions of who they are regardless of whether or not she's changed. So people are prone to questioning her act, and people are prone to bringing up things from her past, and that affects her on an individual level because it doesn't just affect how people perceive her and her morality, whether or not she's a good person. It also affects how she perceives herself because she's always going to be questioning her actions and wondering if she actually is a terrible person, like how everyone else is framing her to be.
Yeah, so that sums it up for cancel culture. Um, it seems like most of these articles are against cancel culture, but I think Vox says it really well with his statement. It's not that you have to be inherently against holding people accountable if you're against the practice of cancel culture. Because rejecting cancel culture does not entail giving up accountability, but it means finding a way where you hold people accountable, but at the same time believe that people are able to change. And I think you can do that with plain call out culture. So let's talk about that right now.
I feel like there is a problem with call out culture as it stands right now. I feel like it does too much, but at the same time, it's not doing enough. Because it's easy to see where call out culture succeeds in cases where it takes down individuals like Kevin Spacey or Harvey Weinstein. And but at the same time, it's easy to see where call out culture goes too far when it targets individuals without any power at all, when it targets like private individuals and takes disproportionate damage to the actual harm that they caused. So it's really hard to balance the power of call out culture with the responsibility that it needs to have to solve the real problems in society. Because call out culture kind of gives people the ability to destroy people without knowing them. This is something that David Brooks said in his article, and I think it's pretty spot on, right? We're essentially just hopping onto the bandwagon. If someone says something, we immediately get this gut reaction to destroy them, even if we don't know the particulars of what exactly happened, right? Context is entirely missing. And this is something that's really hard to balance given our current social media atmosphere, where it's really hard to get context from bits and pieces of text and out of context stuff. We're trying to use call out culture, a tool we use to target individuals to solve larger systemic problems in society. It's like we're trying to remove the root of racism or sexism by targeting an individual at a time. While in some cases that may work, in some cases it's harder to do on an individual level.
Now that's true. Something important to note is that that's a pretty extreme strategy in and of itself, because you're doing something, make a statement, sure, but then you also have to acknowledge how that's going to affect the person that you're calling out, or yeah, the person that you are calling out. Because like Josh said, it is essentially a public shaming. You're prosecuting. Yeah, you're choosing to put someone on the spot, and you're saying that this is something that is definitely wrong. It's something that no one should follow. But there's so many questions as to how this like strategy as to how call out culture should be done, because where because okay, what issues should call out culture be used for? What if like those views that someone holds is something that is actually valid, right? People are often targeted for having more conservative or more religious views, but at the same time, these are things that have shaped them and that have supported them throughout their lives, and there are so many underlying factors that have led them to hold these kinds of views, and to just frame them as something that is illegitimate is, I think, something that is really harmful to that individual, because you're saying that their identity is not something that they should have at the end of the day. And yes, essentially you're silencing them. You're saying that they're kind of evil. You're just painting them as a two-dimensional villain, and you don't really give any way for them to, I guess, atone for their mistakes. But also just the extent of call out culture. You know, this is not something that is strictly just people saying that, oh, what they did is bad. A lot of people choose to bring it to the extent of using ad hominem and attacking the person itself. And they think that this is justifiable because they've done something wrong. But that doesn't justify, abusing someone verbally, physically, like psychologically. And I think that it's just a really slippery slope that people choose to pursue when they are engaging in call out culture.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think if you take it a step further, you'd realize that the more that you focus on attacking an individual or using ad hominem, the more the oppressive behavior or the oppressed, I mean, no, the more the bigoted action or the oppressive institution falls into the background and people forget about the true cause that you're fighting for. Because, like Obama says it really well, you know, if I tweet or hashtag about how you didn't do something right or use the wrong word or verb, then I can sit back and feel good about myself because, oh, I was so woke, I called you out, I did my job. But in reality, that's not real activism. You're not um, taking a long term solution to be able to, I mean, you're not using a long term solution that targets the institution responsible. Like if you equate it to the war on drugs, for example, the way that you solve such a corrupt problem isn't like, I don't know, shooting a bunch of policemen, because these are only people who have been brainwashed and given orders by people in ivory towers who truly have malicious intent when these people are just following orders or have been conditioned to think in a certain way. Like, of course, all of us aren't employees on a payroll, but in a lot of ways, we are sheep that are being led by greater society. And I don't think it's fair for us to be slaughtered just because, like, we're not right now educated enough to be able to counter that behavior.
Yeah, and it really just forms this false dichotomy around a ton of different issues, and it's saying that people that people are either good or bad, and they can't really change, or there isn't any way for them to redeem themselves. And it removes the platform for any kind of compromise, and it makes it so much harder for any actual change to be done, because you're just saying, us versus them, and you don't want to engage with their point of view, with their experiences at all. And, in society, that's not really how you achieve problems. You have to include them in the solution. And I think like that's one reason why it's so hard for us to move forward, because we've become so polarized.
Yeah, and I think that ties in really well with this article that supports call out culture, but in a very specific and nuanced way. So it acknowledges the harm and the psychological impact of insulting a person personally. Because if you think about it, like put yourself in the shoes of someone who has just been called out. When you're put on the spot and you're publicly shamed for something, an average individual doesn't always have the self worth or the self confidence, self esteem to be able to apologize. Like, that's just the way that it is for whatever reason. And if you want to change those people, you need to take that into account. Because if you think about it, people are scared of making mistakes. People are scared of not being liked with their peers. So when you're called out and personally attacked, you're likely to give a hasty apology that just tries to save your reputation as much as possible. Like YouTubers' apologies, like Katerino or Logan Paul. And in those apologies, they try to save their reputation instead of taking accountability for their actions. It's either that or out of their pride or their lack of self-esteem, they're probably going to continue what they're doing and assert and defend their current actions, because that's how confirmation bias works, right? Like, people, if you just call them out as being wrong, no one wants to admit that they're wrong. But if you don't go that far and you try to just, if you rather teach them about the values of tolerance or respect or equality, then they're more likely to change their own behaviors and realize that they're wrong themselves, instead of you shoving it down their throats as if you're better than them and you're trying to lecture them about something. So basically, when you call someone out, this article by Stryker basically suggests you focus on the behavior. You don't go to the person instead of saying that someone is a racist or a bigot, especially when it comes to Twitter. Instead of calling someone a racist or a bigot, talk about what they did as being racist, educate them about the problem, call out the action and not the person. And it's easy to separate those things if you choose your language properly and carefully. So that basically ensures that one, the person is willing to listen, but more importantly, the spotlight is put on the issue itself, and it can't be diluted by any other external actors you're trying to bring into it.
Yeah, so essentially just trying to make call out culture as productive as possible. And, one way to evaluate whether your participation in call out culture is productive is to think about what exactly your motives are, and once you figure out what your goal is, you also should be looking at whether or not what you're going to say is the best way to do it. So is it something that should be done publicly? Is it something that should be done, on a more private basis? Because, call out culture definitely isn't the only way that we can hold people accountable or change people's views. And obviously, we're not always going to be convincing people of what we think is right, but just taking better steps, more productive steps, that's definitely going to make it easier for us to push our cause or push our own values forward. Yeah.
Yeah. So, as Rev said before, it's really important that we try to address the structural issues behind the problems rather than targeting individuals. So, if you see someone out there being racist or sexist, first try to ask yourself, will attacking this person actually help the issue, or will it just like cause a backlash effect where they get entrenched more into their beliefs, right? Because like call out culture isn't necessarily a bad tactic. It's important, however, to realize when it will be effective and when it'll be a problem. So try to understand issues first before trying to delve into them. And if you're gonna try to call someone out, make sure that you address the behavior rather than the individual. Additionally, it's better to call someone out the closer you are to them because like you will understand them more, right? It's generally a bad idea to call someone out on the internet if you just saw like one tweet of theirs and you don't know the person entirely. But if you see someone being problematic and it's someone you personally know, then you have a greater responsibility to try and talk to that person. So I guess that's everything that we wanted to talk about today. Let's try bring up a few points of discussion to see where we ended up throughout this entire thing. Okay, first question. Cancel culture. Is it social justice or merciless mob intimidation? Who wants to start?
Well, like you said, I think it's all in the hands of the user, and it needs to be used responsively. Um, I think it can do a lot of good if we all just stopped and thought before we tweeted about something, and thought about our intentions, thought about our methodology, and made sure that we know what we're doing. Otherwise, like in a majority of instances right now, it's just going to be toxic and unproductive. You have to consider that in some instances, as we said, it might not work because of confirmation bias and people's own insecurities, causing them to become unable to admit their own faults. But more importantly, even if it does work, in a majority of instances, at what cost does it work? Because again, its main methodology is by using fear, by having public hangings, public executions, to keep everyone in line. And I don't think that's in line with democracy and free thought. And it can be just as bad as some toxic behaviors that you're trying to control?
Yeah, I mean, it can definitely be both. And there is a fine line between changing the culture around something that's oppressed people for so long and just harassing people for the hell of it. And it's really going to depend on our own intent and how aware we are of how we're approaching these issues. And I think just really encouraging people to inform themselves more about the issues that they're speaking up about. And I mean, justice systems, they don't really operate the way that call out culture works, right? And I think that definitely people should try to dig deeper into people's circumstances, into their context, try to understand them more before just trying to destroy them, trying to call them out and accuse them for all of these different uh, crimes or offenses.
I think that it's a bit difficult to try and disentangle the two because piling up on somebody is one of the aspects of call out culture. But in the end, it's important to focus on the goal of call out culture, which is trying to even out the playing field, to give a voice to those who have a hard time finding a voice in that society.
Yeah, so our second point of discussion would be, is the possibility of being cancelled an effective tool to deter offensive behavior?
I think using cancel culture or call out culture as a deterrent against offensive behavior, it really depends on where you're having your discussion. Because some places are more open to the idea of collective censorship more than other places. I think that if you try to use call out culture or cancel culture in a place where people really value free speech, then more often than not, people will just go ahead and use offensive words just to try and spite you. I think in the larger context of the world, however, that call out culture or cancel culture to deter people from using certain words that can be discriminatory is effective for trying to police language in more what you call it in more mainstream areas, but it shouldn't be a tool that you should use everywhere because in some places it can backfire.
Mhm. Yeah, it is a really powerful force in that like, call out culture is just built on, I guess, the collective belief that people have, and people really are willing to dig deep into your past and in some instances to find what they can to essentially ruin your reputation. But at the same time, the kinds of offenses that people are using call out culture for, especially when it's in, you know, like office settings, in industries, in a in like professional work where there are actual power structures in play. A lot of the times, these people who want to speak out, they are going to be attacked for speaking out. And a lot of the times, their actions, their courage in speaking about the abuses that they went through, it's not going to lead to anyone being punished. And we see that in so many different examples, right? Especially when you have such powerful people, they essentially use all of all of their power, all of their devices to quiet down any accusations. So in those instances, I think that there are definitely steps, or there are improvements to holding people accountable, but I'm not sure necessarily how to what extent call out culture should be playing into it, because it's very much a structural problem. And while call out culture does empower the people who have been abused, it's also about, you know, attacking those structures and very much very much just tackling things in a very practical way.
Okay, so to sum everything up, given all of our points of discussion, how should we now properly hold people accountable for their bad behavior?
Yeah, I think the simplest answer to this question is just talk to them, especially if they're a person close to you. Calling someone out and hoping that they feel shame and change in the face of that shame isn't really a good way to affect most people. For some people, it may work. Like, they may fear the retribution so much that they'll change their attitudes and behaviors entirely. But more often than not, people may just feel spiteful. So, if someone you know is acting problematic, you can just try talking to them. But I guess that's not something that can really happen in most circumstances, because if you just see someone online and they're doing something wrong, like, you have no direct connection to that person, you can't just talk to them. And this is where the more grayer areas of call out culture can happen, because you can try calling them out in hopes that they'll see your message, but chances are a lot of people are already doing that, and what happens to that person is that they get piled on. And sure, like, this can be fine if it's a public figure who's already used to public scrutiny, who has like that capacity to handle being overloaded. But if it's just someone on the street, like, getting randomly bombarded, then that's not really a fair thing to happen, right? So in the end, there are a lot of things to consider, a lot of tools you can resort to before going to call out culture. And if you are going to try and use call out culture, it's important to ask yourself if the target is actually like deserving of the potential hate you can give.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of criteria that you need to use. You need to examine their intent, whether it's malicious or misinformed. You need to examine their position in society, which would give you more insight into how responsible they really are for the problem. And yeah, based on that criteria, public lynchings should be reserved for only the truly evil and powerful people who do have a choice to do better, but don't. And that for the rest of us who are just idiots, who make mistakes on a daily basis, just like everybody else, a one-on-one conversation or education about the topic is the way to go.
Yeah, just in general, being very understanding when we see people are messing up, because there are so many different factors that are playing into their actions, and their beliefs may not necessarily match up with yours, but that doesn't mean that it's invalid. So just trying to meet people where they are, being more open-minded, and also evaluating your role in the issues that you're passionate about. Call out culture is just one facet of how people can address societal problems, power imbalances, and things like that. You know, you can also consider doing things that are more impactful for those issues and for your communities.
So yeah, guys, that's the end of our second episode. An episode which I think is way longer than the first one, right, guys?
Yeah. My God.
Oh well, it's gonna suck to edit this later, but regardless, it's way more informational than the pineapples on pizza one. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys learned something, and I hope we have an effect on your future tweeting habits, even just a small one. And I guess we'll just see you guys in the next one.
Okay, bye.
Right.
Thanks.
See ya.